200 riders moved in perfect silence, their horses' hooves drumming against the earth like distant thunder. At their head, Chief White Eagle raised his war lance, and every man in Copper Ridge knew what that meant: blood, justice, or war. On his porch, Jake Morrison's tin cup trembled in his weathered hands. But what happened next would silence the entire prairie. 24 hours earlier, Jake Morrison had been just another drifter trying to scratch out a living on 40 acres of stubborn land. His cattle were thin, his fences sagging, and his reputation in Copper Ridge was that of a man who kept to himself, maybe too much. Jake had learned long ago that silence was safer than friendship. Every morning, he'd ride the perimeter of his property, checking for breaks in the fence line, always watching the horizon. The Apache raids had been getting closer to town, and fear hung in the air like smoke from a wildfire. As he saddled his horse that fateful morning, Jake carried the weight of a past he'd never spoken about. 3 years ago, he'd lost his wife and infant son to fever, and since then, every sunrise felt like borrowed time. He'd chosen this isolated patch of land because it matched his soul, raw, unforgiven, and forgotten by most. The heat was already merciless when Jake discovered the young Apache warrior collapsed near his water well. The man couldn't have been more than 20, his body riddled with bullet wounds, his breathing shallow as desert wind. Blood had pooled beneath him, darkening the hard-packed earth. Most men in Copper Ridge would have either finished the job or rode away pretending they'd seen nothing. But something in the warrior's eyes, the same desperate fight for life Jake had seen in his wife's final moments, made him dismount. Jake knew this decision would brand him a traitor in the eyes of his neighbors. Apache raids had claimed 6 settlers in the past month, and the town was thirsting for vengeance. But looking at this dying young man, Jake saw not an enemy, but a son, someone would never hold again. Without hesitation, he lifted the warrior onto his horse and carried him to the small cabin that served as his home. For 2 days and nights, Jake tended to the Apache's wounds, sharing his scarce medical supplies and water. He fed him broth made from his last chicken, cleaned his wounds with his precious whiskey, and sat vigil through the fever that nearly claimed the young man's life. The warrior's eyes would flutter open occasionally, meeting Jake's with a mixture of confusion and gratitude. They couldn't speak each other's language, but pain and compassion needed no translation. But his kindness would soon summon something far greater than gratitude. On the 3rd morning, Jake rode into Copper Ridge for supplies, leaving the recovering Apache hidden in his root cellar. The moment he tied his horse outside Murphy's general store, he could feel the eyes upon him. Sarah Murphy. "Jake Morrison," she called out, loud enough for half the street to hear. "Folks been wondering about the smoke coming from your place these past nights. Mighty strange for a man who usually keeps to himself." Jake touched the brim of his hat. "Just tending to some business, Mrs. Murphy." "What kind of business keeps a man up at night during Apache season?" Her voice carried the sharp edge of suspicion. "Tom Bradley swears he saw tracks near your property, moccasin tracks." The handful of men loitering outside the saloon suddenly found their conversation more interesting. Jake could feel their attention like gun barrels trained on his back. "Can't say I know anything about tracks, ma'am. Just trying to keep my cattle alive like everyone else." But Sarah Murphy wasn't finished. "My husband says you bought enough bandages and laudanum to patch up half the cavalry." Seems mighty generous for a man who's supposed to be watching for raiders, not healing them. The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke. Jake met her stare without flinching. "I reckon what a man does with his own supplies is his own concern." The gathered crowd began murmuring among themselves. Words like sympathizer and traitor drifted through the dust-laden air. Jake purchased his supplies in silence, but he could feel the noose of suspicion tightening around his neck. As he prepared to leave, Sheriff Dalton stepped out of his office, his hand resting on his gun belt. "Morrison," the sheriff called out, "might want to think carefully about the company you keep. These are dangerous times, and dangerous times call for clear loyalties." Jake mounted his horse and rode home with the weight of the town's distrust pressing on his shoulders like a tombstone. But when he reached his cabin and saw the young Apache sitting up, color returning to his face.
Jake knew he'd made the right choice. The warrior pressed his palm to his chest and spoke a single word in his native tongue, a word that sounded like gratitude itself. And in that silence, the land itself seemed to hold its breath. That evening, as Jake prepared a simple meal, he heard the thunder of approaching horses. Through his window, he could see torches cutting through the darkness like angry stars. Sheriff Dalton led a group of 12 armed men, their faces hard as canyon stone. Jake stepped onto his porch, his rifle held low but ready. "Evening, Sheriff," Jake called out, his voice steady as bedrock. "Morrison, we're here on official business. There's been talk about Apache activity on your land. We're here to search your property." Jake's grip tightened on his rifle. "And if I refuse?" Sheriff Dalton's voice carried the chill of winter wind. "Then we'll assume you're harboring enemies of this community, and we'll act accordingly." Behind the sheriff, Jake recognized faces from town. Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, Sam Hutchins, who owned the bank, even young Peter Murphy, probably here to prove his courage to the older men. These weren't soldiers, they were neighbors, driven by fear and prejudice. "You boys mind telling me what exactly you're looking for?" Jake asked. Tom Bradley spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Don't play dumb, Morrison. We know you got an Apache hidden somewhere on this property. Sarah Murphy saw you buying enough medical supplies to run a field hospital. And what if I did help someone who was injured?" Jake's voice carried a quiet challenge. "When did mercy become a crime in Copper Ridge?" The question struck the group like a slap. Some of the men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, but Sheriff Dalton's resolve never wavered. "When that mercy aids and comforts the enemies who've been killing our families," Dalton replied. "Now step aside, Morrison. We're searching this place whether you cooperate or not." Jake felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge. He could fight, but 12 against 1 meant certain death. He could surrender the Apache, but that would mean betraying the trust of a man who'd looked at him with gratitude instead of hatred. In that endless heartbeat of decision, Jake thought of his wife's last words. "Promise me you'll never let fear make you cruel." "All right," Jake said quietly, lowering his rifle, "but I want your word that any man found on my property gets fair treatment. No lynching, no mob justice." Sheriff Dalton nodded grimly. "You have my word." Jake led them to the root cellar, his heart pounding like war drums. When he opened the heavy wooden door, the Apache warrior sat waiting, his wounds still bandaged, but his eyes alert and unafraid. He looked at Jake with understanding, not accusation, but acceptance of whatever fate awaited him. "There he is," Tom Bradley shouted, "proof that Morrison's been harboring savages." The warrior slowly stood. Sheriff Dalton stepped forward, his hand on his gun. "What's your name, Apache?" Dalton demanded. The warrior spoke in his native tongue, then switched to broken English. "I am Running Bear.
son of White Eagle. The name sent a ripple of shock through the assembled men. White Eagle was the most powerful war chief in the territory, a man whose very name could empty settlements and send cavalry patrols racing for reinforcement. "Sweet Jesus," Sam Hutchins whispered, "we got ourselves the chief's son." Tom Bradley grinned like a wolf. "Well, I'll be damned. We just captured the biggest prize in the territory. This Apache is worth more than gold." But Running Bear stepped forward, placing himself between Jake and the armed men. In halting English, he spoke words that would echo through the canyon like thunder. This man, he saved Running Bear when death was near. White man coulda let me die like wounded animal. Instead, he give water, medicine, food. He risk his life for Apache he never meet. Running Bear touched the bandages on his chest. These hands that heal, they belong to man of honor. Sheriff Dalton frowned. That don't change the fact that you've been raiding our settlements. Running Bear shook his head slowly. Running Bear no raid, was hunting deer for sick grandmother when soldiers attack. They shoot, I run. I fall by this man's land, ready to die with dignity. But he choose mercy over fear. From his shirt, Running Bear pulled out a small leather pouch and handed it to Jake. Inside was a turquoise stone carved in the shape of an eagle, the sacred symbol of his father's tribe. "This belonged to my father's father," Running Bear said, "given only to warrior who show greatest courage. You earned this, Jake Morrison." The gathered men fell silent, processing the weight of the revelation. Jake looked down at the sacred stone. "I don't deserve this," Jake said quietly. "Deserve?" Running Bear smiled for the first time since his rescue. "Deserve is for gods to decide. Gratitude is for sons to give." Sheriff Dalton cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the turn of events. "This is all very touching, but fact remains you're still Apache, and there's still a warrant for any Apache found in this territory." "Then you arrest me," said simply. "But know this, Jake Morrison harmed no one. He healed where others would hurt. If this make him criminal in white man's law, then your law has forgotten the heart of Great Spirit." The confrontation hung in the air like morning mist, delicate and ready to vanish with the first strong wind. Jake felt the eyes of every man upon him, weighing his choices, measuring his character. In that moment, raspy, gritty Western voice with a faint Southern drawl, clipped and urgent, with short breaths, whispery undertone, but no dragging. Words snap out quickly, almost like bullets. Minimal intonation, dry and matter-of-fact. Quick pauses only for dramatic tension, then immediate continuation. Feels like an old cowboy telling the tale before the fire burns out. He realized that saving Running Bear had been more than an act of mercy. It had been a test of his own humanity. Kindness could cost me my life, Jake thought, but cruelty would have already killed my soul. Before Sheriff Dalton could respond, the sound of distant drums began echoing across the canyon. Not war drums, these were different, rhythmic and ceremonial. Every man turned toward the sound, hands instinctively moving to their weapons. "What in hell is that?" Tom Bradley whispered. Running Bear listened for a moment, then his eyes widened with recognition and something approaching awe. "My father comes," he said quietly. "White Eagle brings the gathering drum. This sound, it call all tribes to witness." The drumming grew stronger, joined by others, until the very air seemed to pulse with their rhythm. Through the darkness, the flicker of torches appeared on the horizon, dozens of them moving in perfect formation across the prairie. Sheriff Dalton's voice cracked with fear.
How many? Running Bear closed his eyes and listened to the drums as if they were speaking directly to his heart. All of them, he whispered. Every tribe that calls White Eagle brother. They come to see the white man who showed mercy to Chief's son. The approaching procession was unlike anything any of the white man had ever witnessed. Warriors from 7 different tribes rode in perfect formation. Apache, Navajo, Comanche, and others whose names the settlers had only heard whispered in tales of frontier terror. But these riders carried no weapons raised in threat. Instead, they bore ceremonial lances decorated with feathers and sacred symbols. At the head of the massive convoy rode Chief White Eagle himself, a man whose presence commanded respect even from his enemies. His war bonnet caught the moonlight like captured starfire, and his painted horse moved with the grace of legend itself. As the enormous gathering reached Jake's property, White Eagle raised his hand, and 200 warriors fell silent as one. The only sound was the whisper of wind through sagebrush and the nervous breathing of Sheriff Dalton's small posse. Chief White Eagle dismounted and approached Jake with the measured dignity of a man who had never known defeat. His weathered face showed the wisdom of decades, and his eyes held depths that seemed to reflect the eternal sky itself. "I am White Eagle," the chief said in perfect English, his voice carrying the authority of mountains. "This is my son you saved." Jake stepped forward, still holding the sacred turquoise stone. "Chief White Eagle, your son was dying. Any decent man would have done the same." The chief studied Jake's face for a long moment, reading something in his features that others might miss. "No," White Eagle said finally. "Many men would have let Apache die. Some would have hastened his death. You chose different path of honor." Sheriff Dalton found his voice, though it carried a tremor of fear. "Chief White Eagle, we mean no disrespect, but your son was found on our territory during a time of hostilities." White Eagle turned his gaze to the sheriff, and even seasoned lawmen seemed to shrink under that ancient scrutiny. "Hostilities," the chief repeated slowly. "White Eagle did not start these hostilities, but White Eagle can choose to end them." The weight of those words settled over the gathering like snow falling on sacred ground. Every man present understood that they stood at a crossroads of history, a moment where the future of the entire territory hung in the balance. "My son tells me of your kindness," White Eagle continued, addressing Jake directly. "Says you shared food when you had little, gave medicine when supplies were scarce, risked your life among your own people to protect Apache you did not know." White Eagle gestured to the massive gathering behind him. "These warriors, they come from 100 miles in every direction. They come because word spreads quickly among the people when white man shows true courage." From his saddle, White Eagle lifted a beautifully crafted war lance, its shaft inlaid with silver and adorned with eagle feathers. He presented it to Jake with both hands. "This belonged to my grandfather and his grandfather before him. It has never been given to white man. Today, that changes." Jake accepted the lance with trembling hands, feeling the weight of generations of Apache history in its balance. "I don't know what to say, Chief White Eagle." "Say nothing," the chief replied. "Let your actions continue to speak." White Eagle then addressed the entire gathering, both his warriors and the white men who had come to arrest his son. From this day forward, Jake Morrison and his land are under protection of all tribes. Any man who threatens him threatens us. Any man who honors him honors us. The chief's words carried the force of sacred law. But more than protection, we offer friendship. Running Bear will spend each full moon at this ranch, learning the ways of the white man who saved his life. And Jake Morrison will be welcomed at any Apache fire, treated as family, honored as warrior. The transformation was complete. What had begun as a potential lynching had become a ceremony of alliance that would echo through history. As the first light of dawn began painting the eastern sky, the great gathering prepared to depart. But before leaving, each tribal leader approached Jake with gifts. Beautifully crafted blankets, silver jewelry, weapons of extraordinary artistry, and horses that seemed bred from wind and starlight itself. Running Bear was the last to say goodbye. He embraced Jake like a brother, whispering in English that had grown stronger overnight. You showed me that courage is not the absence of fear. Very fast-paced delivery, clipped and urgent, with sharp breaths, whispery undertone but no dragon. Words snap out quickly, almost like bullets. Minimal intonation, dry and matter-of-fact. Quick pauses only for dramatic tension, then immediate continuation. Feels like an old cowboy telling the tale before the fire burns out, but the presence of mercy, despite that fear, I will never forget. As the 200 riders disappeared into the morning mist, Jake stood on his porch, surrounded by gifts that would make him the wealthiest rancher in 3 territories. But the real treasure wasn't the material riches. It was the knowledge that one act of compassion had bridged a gap between 2 worlds that had seemed destined for eternal conflict. Sheriff Dalton and his men rode away in thoughtful silence, their prejudices shaken by what they had witnessed. Word of the ceremony spread throughout Copper Ridge and beyond, transforming Jake from a suspected traitor into a local legend. From that day forward, Jake Morrison's ranch became a symbol of what was possible when fear gave way to mercy, when prejudice yielded to understanding. Travelers would come from hundreds of miles just to see the place where one cowboy's kindness had changed the fate of an entire region. The Apache raids in the territory ceased entirely. Trade agreements replaced warfare. Children of both cultures grew up hearing the story of the cowboy who risked everything to save a dying enemy, and the chief who honored that courage with friendship instead of vengeance. Years later, when historians would write about the end of the Apache Wars, they would point to battles and treaties, to military campaigns and government policies. But the real turning point had been simpler than that. It had been the moment when Jake Morrison saw a dying young man and chose mercy over fear, compassion over convenience. Sometimes the smallest act changes everything. Sometimes mercy can be the greatest form of courage. And sometimes, in the vast emptiness of the frontier, one man's humanity can light a fire that burns away generations of darkness. Would you have risked everything for a stranger's life? Share this story if you believe that courage and compassion can still change the world. And remember, in a time when division seems stronger than unity, we all have the power to choose mercy over fear, just like Jake Morrison did on that dusty morning in Copper Ridge.
Subscribe for more powerful stories that remind us what it means to be truly human. And click on the video on the screen to watch the next one with a twist so unexpected it will restore your faith in the power of second chances.